You're about to see exactly why Trump picked J.D. Vance for VP. His heated exchange we saw 2 weeks ago with NBC's Kristen Welker is a lesson in how to avoid being baited by the media's loaded questions while saying exactly what you have to say. The topic this time, well, the left has been ablaze over the so-called Project 2025 and whether the increased powers it proposed for the president could give Donald Trump the power to go after the Biden family to seek some sort of vengeance. We see a continuation of that fear from Kristen Welker as well, so watch this next clip before I tell you more about it.
Senator, if former President Trump were to win, if you were to be his vice president, would you support him appointing a special prosecutor to go after his political enemies, the Bidens?
Well, first of all, Kristen, I find it interesting how much the media and the Democrats have lost their mind over this particular quote. Donald Trump is talking about appointing a special prosecutor to investigate Joe Biden for wrongdoing. Joe Biden has done exactly that for the last few years and has done far more in addition to that to engage in a campaign of lawfare against his political opposition. I think what Donald Trump is simply saying is we ought to investigate the prior administration. There are obviously many instances of wrongdoing, and frankly, the Biden administration has done far worse. So if you think that what Donald Trump is proposing is a threat to democracy, isn't what Biden has already done a massive threat to our system of law and government?
Now, despite the fact that Trump has stated he does not want political vengeance after assuming office, there's still two caveats to this idea that the Democrats fear. It's the distinction between someone like Hunter Biden's wrongdoings in his personal life versus something like a genuine conflict of interest for Joe Biden when he was vice president, which is obviously no longer a private matter. The second fear is that while the Department of Justice is still technically under the executive branch, something like a Project 2025 could expand the president's power enough for the DOJ to genuinely become politicized and weaponized. The first fear may not become true because Donald Trump and the Republican Party have explicitly distanced themselves from the Project 2025 drawn up by the Heritage Foundation, and J.D. Vance speaks like you would expect a politician to speak, keeping it vague, retaining plausible deniability, and not getting more prematurely specific than he has to. And in the only last week, Donald Trump remarked that he, in fact, would be putting together a special counsel investigation through his attorney general. Of course, that's not evidence of political vengeance until we actually see it, and that's the trouble that someone like Kristen Welker is having, tying J.D. Vance to the position.
Do you support those calls for a revolution, and would political violence ever be justified?
Well, of course, political violence is never justified, Kristen. You'll have to ask the president of the Heritage Foundation to defend his remarks if you'd like to do that. I will say, look, the Heritage Foundation does a lot of good work. It does a lot of things that I disagree with, a lot of things that I agree with. But the Heritage Foundation is a nonprofit organization that works on public policy, and I think it's an important part of how D.C. functions and operates. We'll continue to have important conversations in the Republican Party with a whole host of think tanks from the right and from the left as we craft public policy. That's the way the city works. And again, I'm not going to be the person who serves as a spokesperson for the Heritage Foundation. I don't have any affiliation.
See what I mean? That was the most appropriate middle road to take. You don't want to be left looking like you defend something you don't. Especially not when it's a whole 900-page document that he likely even had that time to read fully. As we speed toward the election, you probably are going to hear Donald Trump saddled with this so-called Project 2025. That's because it fits perfectly into the authoritarian image that the media would love to paint, and of course, to be fair, the document does have some pretty controversial proposals, like reclassifying tens of thousands of civil service workers as political appointees, and the president could not appoint and replace as he sees fit. And it also brings the DOJ more in direct control of the executive branch under the president, but Donald Trump himself put out a complete and unequivocal statement just a few weeks ago, fully distancing himself from the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 and some of the controversial statements its president Kevin Roberts has made. He put out a statement on Truth Social saying, "I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who it is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things that they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck. But I have nothing to do with them." If you actually skim through the entire document, you realize that Project 2025 is less of a blueprint and more like a wish list of what something from the far-right interpretation would love. For example, the plan is even further right to Donald Trump on issues like abortion when he's made it clear for this current campaign that he believes he wants to devolve the abortion issue down to the state level. The document is also much further right to him on the consolidation of power around the president, which would require an overhaul and revamp of the entire structure of the executive branch. Obviously, since we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know what impact the Project 2025 blueprint could have on a potential Trump presidency. But if words were all that we had to go by, Donald Trump has made sure in the past few weeks to distance himself from the controversial project, and you see something similar from J.D. Vance.
Do you support access to abortion medication as Donald Trump does?
Well, Kristen, you asked about Project 2025, and I want to be clear here that Trump explicitly has said his own transition team runs the Trump transition and will run the Trump administration. Again, you have a whole host of organizations, some of which have good ideas, some of which have bad ideas, and some of which have both. On the question of the abortion pill, what so many of us have said is that, look, we certainly don't. The Supreme Court made a decision saying that the American people should have access to that medication. Donald Trump has supported that opinion. I support that opinion. I think it's important to say that we actually have to have an important conversation in this country about what our abortion policy should be.
That's for sure. But if you understand Donald Trump, you realize that there's hardly an issue so important that he would sacrifice political points for. And it's just so happening that in the last few years, the Republican Party overall has had a really rough time trying to appeal to more young and female voters for a staunchly pro-life stance, and it's led to the party to suggest they need to be softer on the stance of abortion or else see the party platform lose out, which is perhaps what you saw translated with Donald Trump finally took the weight off his shoulders and relegated abortion as a state issue rather than a federal one. But J.D. Vance was smart in not taking the approach for this next question about the election.
Well, here we are about a week before the Republican convention. Before I let you go, can you say unequivocally here and now that you will accept the results of the 2024 election no matter what they are?
So long as it's a free and fair election, Kristen, of course we will. We will use constitutional processes to challenge issues if we think there are issues. But if it's a free and fair election, we will do what the Constitution requires. We will respect the results, and I expect those results are going to be to re-elect Donald Trump. I think that feeding into people's concerns about our electoral process is that one half of America's political segment, they won't support legislation that makes it harder for illegal aliens to vote. They won't support universal voter ID in our elections, even though you have to present ID to do almost anything in this country. I think taking people's concerns seriously about election fraud is the way to reinforce security and confidence in our elections.
You can tell that he's trained to handle questions like this, which is perhaps partly why Donald Trump chose JD as his running mate in the first place. And he's right, in fact, about the last part, because just a few days after this interview aired, the House of Representatives passed the SAVE Act. By a thin majority split between the parties, the SAVE Act, also called Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, passed the House 221 versus 198. That means 198 Democrats, including 5, voted against a bill that calls the voter identification on Election Day to root out any chance of the House Democratic introducing an act allowing illegal migrants to vote, which is already something that California has been considering for the past year. But we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. Right now, J.D. Vance's ability to answer a question while leaving some space open for the potential Donald Trump presidency means he's certainly someone Trump would want on his side. How far they stray on their policy positions in office will be a question that can be answered before November.